About a year ago, almost like to the day, my partner and I sat here and answered a bunch of questions for a 1K subs Q&A special, and in the year since, I've gained another 9,000 subscribers and I finally reached 10K. Thank you! So that means I have to do a Q&A thingy. Here it is. The way this is going to work is I'm going to focus first on questions from my patrons, and my deal with my patrons was that they could ask me any questions and I would have to answer every single one, and all the other questions that I'm going to answer, I'm just going to select ones that I like based on what people ask me via social media. If I didn't answer your question, sorry. So over first to Patreon, and Chris has asked, what is a line in a book that has stuck with you? There's a lot of lines in books that have stuck with me, and so I'm gonna have to pick the first one that came to my mind, which is one of the first books I ever read in my late teens, which was the very final line of The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. If you haven't read it, this line out of context isn't gonna spoil anything, but the very final line of that book is Lyra says that she wants to build the Republic of Heaven. And that line pretty much informed my philosophy, my politics, my attitude towards religion, everything. It was a huge deal for me, that final line, build the Republic of Heaven. It turned me into what I am today, at least in a very minor way. It was the spark that started me. Chris also asked, what is a book that has changed how you see the world, if only slightly? And the first one that came to mind was a book I read last year in 2020? Humankind by Rutger Bregman. I'm a big fan of Rutger Bregman, and his book helped me see that people are a lot kinder than you think they are, even down to a biological sense. We have so much bad news all of the time. The world, media, politics, it all pits us against each other, and you come to realize that none of that is really true in a lot of different ways, and he debunks a lot of lies and studies and famous things that have happened throughout history and novels and literature and all kinds of things that frame us in a bad light, and none of it is actually true, and he does such a great job of debunking it and just framing humanity in a much kinder light. And Chris's third question was, if you were a cheese, what kind of cheese would you be? I had to ask Jess this question, and she came up with a great answer. So Jess said that I'm brie, because I'm pretty soft on the outside and even softer on the inside, and if you put me under pressure, I just melt. I thought that was such a good answer, and I also really, really like cranberries, and everyone likes brie and cranberry. So there you go. Chris, I'm a very soft and squidgy brie. Ian over at Patreon asked, it's 2072 and you are chilling in a space pod orbiting Mars. It's time to open your 50-year memory box that you've created for your future self. What 3 books would be in there? So I'm not just going to say my 3 favorite books or 3 books that mean a lot to me. I'm going to pick 3 books that are kind of defining me in this moment now. One of those books would be Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. Another would be probably Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami. And I'm going to throw in 100 Boyfriends by Bronte Purnell. A trans book, a book by my favorite Japanese author, and a very gay book. I feel like those 3 things sum me up pretty well. Another patron question comes from Kira, who asks, your reviews are so thought out and analytical, truly unlike anything I've ever seen. Wow. How do you keep track of all your thoughts and observations and use them to draw your conclusions? I don't write anything down. This is a weird thing about me. One of my favorite videos that I ever made was my review of Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, and I didn't write anything down. I actually rewatched that video, which is a weird thing to do, but I rewatched it a few weeks ago because I'm an egomaniac. And I was so impressed by my own analysis, and yet I didn't write anything down. I read that book, I closed it, and I turned on my camera, and I just filmed a review. And I was really happy with how it turned out, so I don't write shit. I mean, I do also write written reviews, so I do write shit, but even those are just like off the top of my head. I don't make notes. Where do you regularly find translated fiction? This is also from Kira. We get sent a lot of review copies now. We are very close to a lot of indie publishers that deal with translated fiction, and we kind of rely on them to send us books. But otherwise, I just Google things. I just search online for the best translated fiction that's coming out every year, and it's just literally Googling things and going on bookshop websites, Waterstones, even Amazon, anything that is going to be cataloging what's coming up soon, it'll be there, so you can search anything, and it really is it, I just Google things. And Kira also asked, what 3 things have surprised you most when it comes to running your channel? One thing that surprised me and was a huge relief to me is just how nice people are. In the book corner of YouTube, people are really lovely. Almost every comment, 99.5% of comments that I get are lovely. I get a few comments that are a little irate and antagonistic, and they are always from men. Other than that, it really is such a lovely, warm heartwarming space. I love making content for YouTube in this particular corner of YouTube. Whenever I make videos about manga, I get a little bit nervous because the manga community, the anime community, they can be really terrifying people. So I get a little nervous when I make manga videos. I even feel nervous while I'm making them because I'm like, if I say one thing wrong, oh my god, the comments. But when it comes to books and literature or whatever, it's lovely. Another thing is how critical I've become of myself, especially when it comes to editing. You have to watch yourself, you're staring at yourself, you can judge your physical appearance, your voice, your mannerisms, and you get a little bit obsessed over editing and getting things looking just right. And that one is actually kind of a two-part answer, so I've also learned to kind of let go of that. So I noticed that at first and I was very critical, and now over time I've learned to just keep in a few things. Like I used to edit out every time I took a breath. Now I don't do that as much. I assume that people don't mind because I don't mind when I watch videos and people take a breath. Okay, on to questions that came to me via Twitter. My friend Callum asked, is there a book that you've never had the chance to mention on your channel that you would love to give a shout out? I think I have mentioned this on my channel, but it is a book series that I just am so desperate for everybody to read. I don't read that much fantasy anymore, but this is a fantasy series that has stuck with me, and I know very, very few people who've ever read it, and that is the Ketty J series by Chris Wooding. If there was one fantasy series I would recommend to anyone and everyone, it is those books. They start with Retribution Falls, and they are some of my favorite books of all time. I'm taking this opportunity to mention the Ketty J books by Chris Wooding. Please read them. If you're a fantasy or sci-fi fan, please, please read those books. There's 4 of them, and they're amazing. Callum then asked, what's the best bookshop you've ever been to? And I go to a lot of great bookshops all around the world. It's really, really hard to pick a favorite, and I feel like I would just be excluding others. But I'm going to pick the Common Press, which is in Shoreditch in London. They're a brand new bookshop. They are queer. They promote primarily queer writers, writers of colour, transgender writers, and I've had wonderful experiences there. I love the staff there. I went to a poetry reading there a few months ago. I met the owners of Cypher Press there, so I love the Common Press. It's also a very new bookshop, so if you're in London or the UK in general, please go visit them, buy a book, get a cup of coffee, go to one of their events. The Common Press is wonderful. And then Callum asked, where are you taking me first when we sail away on our boat? Oh, Callum. I think we should go to Iceland first because Callum loves Iceland. I have never been to Iceland, and he can show me around and show me why he loves it so much. Although it's pretty obvious. Like, it's Iceland, it's beautiful, I get it, but show me. My next Twitter question comes from Jill. So Jill is on BookTube as well as The Book Bully, and I always promise to promote her channel more, and I just don't. Jill said that in my last Q&A video where Jess was here, I replaced Jess with Bimini, you called me a lovely lady. Would you still use those words to describe me? No. Anita asks, what book intimidates you? And I would say any book that's pretty big intimidates me, mostly because I just can't afford the time to dedicate to a long book. So like, I'll never read Proust. I will die before I read Proust. Who can read Proust? And that means I also haven't read a lot of Russian classics. I haven't read Les Mis. There's a lot of books that I really want to read, and they don't intimidate me because they look scary or difficult. They're just too big, and I find it hard to dedicate so much time. I am 90% sure I have undiagnosed ADHD, and I just struggle. I also like putting out articles and videos regularly, and if I have to spend several weeks reading a single book, what am I supposed to do in the meantime? Yago asked, what country haven't you been to yet and are most interested in exploring, and have you read any of its books? Argentina. I love the literature of Argentina, and it is the books of Argentina that have turned me into a big fan of that country. And since then, I've done a lot of research and watched travel videos, and it looks like the most beautiful place, and I've never been, so Argentina. Alyssa asked, have you come across any bookstore cats in your travels? Oh yeah. Almost always in small, musty secondhand bookshops, you'll find a cat. I'd never learn their names or anything, but yeah, you meet a lot of bookstore cats, and they're always in musty little bookshops in the UK or the US. Oh, I love them. Heather asked, do you speak Japanese, and what resources do you use? I am a perpetual student of Japanese. I have lived in Japan on and off over the last 5 years, and I'm hoping to move back to Japan in 2022, possibly permanently. And so because I'm always in and out of Japan, my Japanese level goes up and down, up and down. You know, at one point I knew 300 kanji, now I know maybe 100. I recently subscribed to WaniKani, and they are an incredible resource for learning kanji. And then I've used a lot of different apps like Duolingo, Lingodeer. There's a really good textbook that I got off Amazon that is called Speak Japanese in 90 Days. And it's by someone Marks. I don't know, I'll put a picture of it here. That is a really amazing book. I was living in Korea, getting ready to move back to Japan, and I read that book and I felt like I was becoming fluent, especially in terms of grammar. I felt confident in asking questions and having conversations. So I do speak Japanese, but only to a kind of conversational level, and my studies and ability and fluency just goes up and down, up and down. Honestly, it plummets to next to nothing. When the pandemic started, I felt like I couldn't speak a word of Japanese anymore. It just goes out of my head. But I've gotten to a point where I can have conversations, and I'm looking to become fluent, provided I move back there, which gives me a reason to actually study. My friend Rick, who is also on BookTube as Rick, Rick McDonnell. Rick is one of my favourite people in the whole wide world. He's one of my dearest and best friends. I love him to pieces, and I have a huge crush on him. And Rick asked, now that you've hit 10k, do you think you'll shut up about it? I have been taunting Rick and telling him about hitting 10k for months, and I've finally done it. Who knows? Rick, who knows? I'll think about it. My friend Barbara asked, what's your favourite Adele song? So Barbara and I are in a big group chat, and it was a really big deal when I revealed to the group chat that I don't have a clue who Adele is. It's just not the music I listen to. I'd somehow just avoided Adele my entire life. Hey guys, your answer. Roast me in the comments. Adit asked, if you were stranded on an island with only 3 books by Asian authors specifically, which 3 would it be? Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, Breasts and Eggs by Miyako Kawakami, and maybe Out by Natsuo Kirino. I really like that book. It's long, it's disgusting, it's brilliant, it's angry. I think I'd have fun with that one. That's just off the top of my head. I also realised you said Asian, not specifically Japanese, but those are the ones that came to mind. There you go, I didn't plan that. Meanie asked, what's your favourite genre and why? My favourite genre fiction has always been fantasy, and it very much is not anymore. I am on a huge science fiction kick at the moment. I cannot read enough sci-fi, and I've also learned to really love murder mystery novels. I've made a lot of videos about Agatha Christie recently, Seishi Yokomizo, a lot of great Japanese crime writers. So the murder mystery genre and science fiction and horror. I love horror in every medium. I love horror movies, horror video games, horror manga, Junji Ito, oh my god, and horror literature as well. This is a sweet one. Someone called S. Drew asked, any travel advice for those who would love to see the world but are very shy and nervous? Yeah, I think what you need to do is lower your expectations and just travel within your own comfort zone. Take baby steps, go to a place that you think is safe, although safe is a very relative term depending on who you are and where you're going and why. And just travel for yourself. Definitely do some research, prepare yourself, learn emergency phone numbers and get the right currency, things like that. But really just try to travel within your own means. Don't try to travel in a way that you think you should. Just go where you want to and do what you want when you're there. You don't have to fill an itinerary, nobody cares, just travel as you want to. Quite a few people have asked me, do you have any plans to write a novel? I've actually written about 5 novels. Beginning to end, they've been finished. I've sent them off to agents and they've been rejected. I've been rejected like 50 times for a bunch of different novels. I wrote my first novel when I was about 22, and I've just started writing a new one, which is probably my 6th or 7th. So yeah, I've written a bunch of novels. I send them off, they get rejected, and I start a new one, and the cycle goes on. I don't really talk about it because I find it a bit cringe when unpublished writers keep talking about the books that they're writing. It just makes me sad, so I don't do it. But a bunch of people asked me this question, so yes, I've written a bunch of novels. They just haven't seen the light of day. Cinnamon Swords, great name, asked, what are your passions and hobbies besides literature? I have a huge number of hobbies. I am a hobby maniac. My favourite hobby in the whole world is playing the drums. I am a drummer, I love it. I haven't picked up a pair of drumsticks in years though, because I travel the world, most people live in cities, apartments. How am I supposed to have a drum kit? It's a very logistically difficult thing to do, but it's my favourite hobby. I would get rid of all my books in exchange for a soundproof room and a drum kit. Other than that, I watch a lot of anime, I play a lot of video games. Video games, since I was a kid, have always been my biggest hobby. Studying languages. I go jogging every day. Even though I'm chubby, I love going running. But I guess my biggest hobby is music, other than literature. As I said, I play the drums, and I listen to a lot of music all day, every day. I have a terrible answer to this one, but I'm gonna say it anyway. If you could have 1 hour with any non-living writer or poet, who would it be and what would you ask them? I honestly just want to ask Mary Shelley how she did it. That's it. That's really all I want to know. Mary Shelley is one of my favourite authors. Frankenstein is my all-time favourite novel. I want to know how she did it, especially at the age that she was. I'm desperate to know the answer to that. I love this question. Okay, someone at KD Books asked, what was the first album you ever bought with your own money? Oh my god, okay. The first album that I ever bought was Chocolate Starfish and the Hot Dog Flavoured Water by Limp Bizkit. And I'll give you the next one for free. The second album I ever bought was the Marshall Mathers LP by Eminem. I grew up in the 90s. I was about 10, 11 years old when those albums came out, and they were the biggest albums of that time. I mean, I guess it wasn't my own money, it was pocket money. Whatever. The first album I ever bought was Chocolate Starfish. Charlotte asked, what book prizes have you followed and are interested in following? I primarily follow the Booker International far more than the main Booker Prize and the Women's Prize. Those two, because that's what I do. I mostly read books by women, and I mostly read international books in translation. Someone called Buka asked, what book do you gift the most? I don't. I never give people books as presents. And when I do, for birthdays, Christmas, whatever, I usually get them a present that I know that they'll like, rather than a book I want them to read. Daniela asked, what are your favourite tropes in literature? I don't really go in for tropes. I don't really notice them. I don't really think about them. But the only trope that comes to mind straight away is found family. I love found family in literature, especially in fantasy and science fiction. The found family dynamic is everything to me, so that one. Isabel asks, what got you started reading translated books? I went into a bookshop in Bristol after moving home from Japan, and I picked up a novel by Hiromi Kawakami, Strange Weather in Tokyo. I read it, and it blew me away. That was it. It was having lived in China and Japan, and then picking up a Japanese novel and loving it. All of that led me to this. This is such a great question. I love this one. Sorry if I say your name wrong. Tatev asked, if you could choose one writer, dead or alive, to write down the story of your life, or write a story with you as a character in it, who would you choose? Love this question. I don't like myself very much. I struggle with self-esteem, and I think if I gave myself as a character to Kazuo Ishiguro, my favorite author, I think he would create a character that I could empathize with. I feel like he would write a character that I would like and that I would appreciate. That's kind of a somber answer, but it's the best I've got. Sophie asked, how are you feeling regarding UK citizens' loss of freedom within the EU? Brexit has made me angry now for 5 or 6 years, however long it's been. I think it's the most embarrassing thing that's happened. I think it highlights the fact that our state media is incredibly propagandist, and by design almost, the British people are very, very gullible. And I think it takes a lot to unpack historically, class-wise, race-wise, all sorts of things, why we are like that as a country, why we're so nationalistic. It's too much to go into right now, obviously, but Brexit is an embarrassment. It is a political, economic, social embarrassment. And I kind of feel sorry for everyone who fell for it. Brexit is embarrassing. That's how I feel. And I have very little love for this country as a result. In fact, I was never supposed to be here. The pandemic chased me back to the UK. I wasn't supposed to be here right now. Rosario asked, if you could only read books from one country for the rest of your life, which country would it be and why? My immediate reaction was Japan. But then I thought, actually, a lot of my favourite writers do actually come from the UK and the US. So I'd be tempted to say the US. It's tough. So many of my favourite writers are British or American. But I'm gonna say Japan, because Japanese literature just doesn't let me down. And there's so much Japanese literature left that I haven't read yet. There's always more. Pani Kitchcock asked, do you watch Asian movies or dramas? If so, what are your favourites? Dramas, no. But I'm a big anime fan, and I'm a huge fan of Korean movies. I watch a lot of Korean films. The films of Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, films like A Tale of Two Sisters, The Age of Shadows, is that what that's called? The one with Gong Yoo, it's a historical drama. A Taxi Driver, not Taxi Driver, I think it's called A Taxi Driver. It's a wonderful film. I'm a huge fan of Korean movies, absolutely huge, especially Korean horror. So yes, I love Korean films. In terms of trying to pick favorites, I mean, Train to Busan is infinitely rewatchable, as is Oldboy, as is The Handmaiden. But I guess, arguably the best movie ever made is Parasite. Like, it's not my favorite film, but I think it's perfect. I really think Parasite is the most perfect film I've ever seen in my life. Maybe I should do film reviews. I'd love to do film reviews. Let me know in the comments if you want to see film reviews. I would do that. Oof. Okay, so Ina asked, what is your all-time favorite album? I don't think you want to ask that question. I don't talk about it ever on this channel or really anywhere, but I'm a colossal music fan and music collector. I listen to about 5 new albums per week. I am constantly obsessed and addicted to finding new music and new albums. I find it overwhelming, honestly. So picking a favorite album ever is impossible. So instead, I'm just going to list off a few of my favorite artists from different genres. I'm a big metalhead, so one of my favorite albums ever is actually The Hunter by Mastodon, as well as Crack the Sky, both of those Mastodon albums I love. One of my favorite folk albums ever is actually Bon Iver's second album, Bon Iver. That's probably the album I've listened to most in my life. One of my favorite bands from when I was a kid that I still listen to every day pretty much is My Chemical Romance, and I think Danger Days is their best album. Don't argue with me. But I mean, I love all of their albums, but Danger Days is special. I also grew up on punk. One of my favorite punk bands is Against Me, and for obvious reasons, one of my favorite albums by them is Transgender Dysphoria Blues, which I mentioned in a poem I wrote recently. I could go on and on. One of my favorite death metal bands is Aborted. I love every album Aborted have done. I'm also a huge fan of tech metal and what you call gent metal, like Meshuggah, so I'm a huge Meshuggah fan. Tool, love Tool. One of my favorite bands of all time is Rush, the Canadian prog rock band. Neil Peart is a huge influence on me. 2112 is one of my favorite albums. My favorite band of right now is Haken, who are a British prog rock band. I love Haken. Vector is my favorite album of theirs. I could go on and on and on, but my favorite genres are death metal, black metal. Oh, I didn't even mention any black metal bands. Oh god. Prog rock, prog metal. I'm a huge metalhead. Black, death, and prog metal are my 3 favorite genres. There you go. Did I take a breath? Amy Walsh asked, what's your favorite country that you visited and how does it impact... No, I read that wrong. What's your favorite country that you visited and how does having been to that country impact your experiences of reading books from that country? My favorite country in the whole world is Japan. I think everyone knows that. And my favorite literature also comes from Japan. I don't know if I can elaborate more on that. The more Japanese literature that I read, the more my relationship with Japan gets complicated because a lot of great Japanese literature, especially by women, demonstrates the hardships and difficulties of modern day Japanese life. And I'm not a weeaboo. I'm very aware of all of the problems of Japan, economical, political, social. I'm very aware of those things. So my relationship with Japan only gets more complicated the more literature I read. But I still love being in Japan and I still love Japanese literature the most. Someone under the name Typical Snapshot said, could you imagine what you were getting yourself into with this channel? I imagine it must take a good deal of time aside from your job to read all these books, plan and shoot all these videos. This is my job, which is awesome. Not the channel, not the YouTube channel, but Books and Bao is my job. The channel makes up like 5% of the work and the revenue and everything. I dedicate a lot of time to it because I want to see it grow. But the blog, booksandbao.com, is my job. I am a blogger, I am a freelance writer, but primarily Books and Bao is my job. So I'm really lucky. I mean, I went through a lot of depressing and agonizing teaching jobs to get here, but I'm very proud of the fact that I am a full-time blogger. I already really answered this question, but Lauren asked, what was the very first Asian novel that you read? Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami. That was a huge impact on me. And then she also asked, what translated piece of fiction do you recommend everyone should read? That's a great question. One piece of translated fiction, I think that's too big a question because we often forget all of the classics that are in fact translated. Great works of French literature, Russian literature, fucking Kafka. There are so many writers that are part of the literary canon that we often forget are in fact translated. So, I mean, I could just recommend Kafka. I'm a huge Kafka fan and I think everyone should read him. In fact, yeah, I'm going to say Kafka. Read The Trial. Mike Prendergast, I think this is the last question by the way, asked, you have mentioned that you enjoy reading fantasy and science fiction. What would be your top 3 recommendations for someone who's never read that genre but wants to dip their toe in? I would say Becky Chambers. I recently discovered her and I think she's the perfect way into science fiction. In terms of fantasy, I actually think Robin Hobb She is one of my favourite fantasy writers, maybe my favourite fantasy writer, and I think what's great about Robin Hobb is that she writes very simplistically and easily. There isn't that much complex world building at all. It's primarily focused on the characters and their relationships, and they are wonderful. Robin Hobb's books are more like literary fiction within a fantasy world than they are really, really intricate, detailed Lord of the Ringsy style fantasy. Thank you so much to everyone who has supported me. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed. Thank you especially to my patrons. Join my Patreon if you really want to give me even more support, more help. I would really appreciate it. And subscribe for books.